Hello Year 7, welcome to this week's classics lesson. First thing that we're going to do today is to mark the timeline that you did 2 weeks ago. So find yourselves something to mark with, perhaps a different colour to the one that you wrote with, and then I'd like you to mark it carefully and neatly, and if you've missed anything out you can fill the words in now. Okay, are we ready? The Minoans lived on Crete and the surrounding islands and flourished between 2000 and 1400 BCE. Minoan civilization is named after legendary King Minos, whose wife gave birth to the Minotaur. The Minoans were great traders, so they were wealthy and prosperous. The Minoans were artistic and peace-loving. Minoan civilization collapsed after the volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, after which the Mycenaeans invaded. The Mycenaeans lived mostly on the mainland of Greece and flourished between 1600 and 1000 BCE. Mycenaean civilization is named after the city of Mycenae, which was very rich and powerful. The Mycenaeans were warlike and always on the lookout for new lands and raw materials. They also traded widely. Most of the Greek myths date from Mycenaean times, and the Trojan War took place at the end of the period. The Mycenaeans were destroyed by civil war and invasion. The Minoans and Mycenaeans were around approximately 1,000 years and together made up the early period of Greek civilization. At the end of the Mycenaean period, Greece was plunged into around 300 years of chaos with constant wars and migration of different peoples. There are few archaeological remains from this time and no writing, so we know very little about it, and that's why it's called the Dark Age. Eventually things settled down and the population grew rapidly. New city-states, usually ruled by tyrants and based on the old Mycenaean kingdoms, started to emerge. The art of writing was rediscovered. The new city-states struggled to feed their populations, so they sent young people off to found colonies in other places. This marked the second great spread of Greek culture. When most people think about the ancient Greeks, it is the classical period that springs to mind. Greece was at its most creative, inventing things like mathematics, drama, sculpture, astronomy, philosophy, and democracy. Athens was the richest city-state, or polis, and became the centre of Greek culture. The classical period was short-lived and descended into further civil war. Alexander the Great rose to power in the north of Greece and unified the country for the first time before going on to conquer most of the known world. He built Alexandria in Egypt, and this took over as the centre of culture with its very famous library. This period did not continue for long after Alexander's death, and Greece was eventually taken over by the new regional superpower, Rome. Okay, can you add up how many you got right? And that doesn't include the ones that you've just written in now. And put a neat mark out of 20 on your sheet, please. Keep it somewhere safe and then we will stick it in your exercise book. And so to today's work, and these are the objectives that we're aiming to fulfill today. I want you by the end of the lesson to know the story of the births of the first Olympian gods. I also want you to develop listening and note-taking skills, and I want you to develop comprehension and story writing skills. So today is an important lesson, and it actually forms the baseline assessment that you will do for classics. In a few moments I'm going to tell you a story, and that is in fact the story of the births of the first Olympian gods. You're going to need to listen very carefully and I'm going to ask you to write some brief notes while I'm telling you the story. Don't want you to try and write down everything I say because you won't be able to. Just a few key words to help you to remember the story. And then when I finish telling the story, you're going to answer some comprehension questions on it, and you're going to write part of it as a story in your own words. So these are the skills that we need for classics higher up the school. If you choose to do GCSE, you will have to answer comprehension questions, and story writing skills are very useful for developing your essay writing because it involves the same sort of thing, including detail in the right order, writing fluently in an interesting manner, and getting all the facts straight. So you'll need to have a piece of paper by you and something to write rough notes. Now, nobody is going to look at the rough notes apart from you. So as long as they make sense to you, that's absolutely fine. Okay, so I'll tell you when you need to start writing your notes, and that isn't just yet. Before we start, I want to just link this to last week's lesson when you were writing down the story of how the world was made. So the very last thing that you wrote down was about a group of 12 called the Titans, who were giants and who came before the Olympian gods in Greek mythology. So I'm just going to show you the names of these. Some of you might know these already. You don't need to write them down and you don't need to remember them particularly. It's really just out of interest. Okay. So there were 6 male Titans whose names were Coeus, Crius, Cronos, Hyperion, Iapetus, and Oceanus. And you might recognise Hyperion as being associated with the sun, and Oceanus, as his name suggests, associated with the sea. There were also 6 females, and they were called Mnemosyne, Phoebe, Rhea, Thea, Themis, and Tethys. Okay. Perhaps the only one you will recognise there is Phoebe, which of course is a name that we use these days. Phoebe was associated with the moon. Okay, but you'll notice here that I've got 2 names in bold, Cronos and Rhea, and that's because the story that we're going to do today concerns these 2. So the male in the story is Cronos and the female in the story is Rhea. A word or two more about making notes before we start the story then. This is a very important and useful skill, so it's good to start practicing now. Notes should be brief. Don't try to write down everything your teacher says. Write down the key information and words that your teacher puts up on the board, or in this case on the next slide. And you can use abbreviations and symbols such as the ampersand, the and sound, or a plus for and. As you get older, you'll develop your own style of making notes, I'm sure. So the key thing is not to try to write down absolutely everything I say. Here we go with the story then, and this is the point at which you need to start writing. So, as time went on, the first 3 deities that the Greeks had, G, Uranus and Pontus, really just turned into the things that they represented. So G became the earth, Uranus became the sky, and Pontus became the sea. I suppose you could say that they sort of retired from public life, and that left a little bit of a power vacuum in Greece. So the Cyclopes and the 100-handed giants weren't very ambitious, but the Titans perhaps were a little more so. And Cronos, who is variously either the youngest or the oldest of the Titans, depending on your view, he decided that he wanted to be the king of the whole world. Cronos was quite a bossy and domineering sort of character, and to be fair, most of his brothers and sisters were a little bit scared of him. So when he announced that he wanted to be the king of the whole world, they didn't really argue with him. And so that's what happened. He became the king of the world. and he set about making himself look very important to everybody else. So he chose a mountain, although not Mount Olympus, and there on the top of the mountain he built himself an enormous palace, and in the enormous palace he built himself an enormous banqueting hall where he was going to be able to hold parties for his family and friends. And in the banqueting hall, with a really good view out of the window, he had made a great big and imposing throne on which he could sit and give everybody orders. Now, obviously, all that took some time and he was quite absorbed in that task. But once it was finished and he'd sat on his big throne and looked out of the window at the world that he ruled quite a lot, he realised that actually now he was a bit bored and he needed something else in his life. He thought to himself, what can I do to spice my life up a bit, to make things a bit more exciting? And he thought for a while, and suddenly an idea popped into his head. Oh, I know, I'll get married, he said to himself. So he looked out of the window to see who there was around that he could possibly marry. Now, unfortunately, the Cyclopes and the 100-handed giants were all men, and, he didn't really fancy any of them anyway. So that left his sisters. I know you'll all be horrified and holding up your hands in horror at this, but that was the way it was when you were starting to populate a world from scratch. So Cronos summoned his sisters to his banqueting hall and he made them line up down the middle. And he walked along the line inspecting them. Now, I have to say, you would never get away with this sort of behaviour these days, but of course things were different back then. And Cronos walked along the line, looked at his first sister and went, oh no, you won't do, you're far too small. The next one turned out to be too tall, the next one was too skinny, the next one was too fat, the next one was the worst of all because she was too cleverer than him, and he wasn't having that. And then, fortunately, he got to the end of the line and there was Rhea, and she was absolutely perfect. The right size, but perhaps more importantly, she was very beautiful to look at and not very bright. Perfect, said Cronos. You will be my wife. There was no getting down on one knee and proposing or anything like that. Rhea was just commanded to be his wife, and that is what happened. So a marriage was announced and they invited everybody that they could think of, and that didn't really amount to very many people. A few of the other Titans had got together and they'd had a few children, but, really the world was largely unpopulated. So there weren't many guests that were going to be invited. Anyway, the day of the wedding came and the banqueting hall was decorated. Food was prepared, musicians were invited, and, it looked for all the world like a properly good wedding setup. Anyway, on the morning of the wedding, Cronos was getting ready, combing his beard and that sort of thing, and there came a knock at the door. Come in, said Cronos in his big booming voice, and in walked a pair of brothers, and these were called Prometheus and Epimetheus. These were the children of a couple of the other Titans. We won't worry about them at the moment. Prometheus means foresight in Greek and Epimetheus means hindsight. Prometheus was able to foresee the future, and he'd had a rather frightening vision that he felt he should tell Cronos about. What is it? Said Cronos. I am getting married today. I haven't got all day, So Prometheus and Epimetheus shuffled a bit, and then eventually Prometheus spoke up and he said, I've had a terrifying vision about your marriage to Rhea. Spit it out then, said Cronos. Well, it's like this, said Prometheus. If you marry Rhea and you have children with her, one of your children will depose you. For those of you that don't know what that means take away the throne. So you can only do that to a king or queen. So if you have children with Rhea, one of your children will depose you. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," said Cronos. "I'm the most powerful person in the world. Nobody's going to depose me. Go and take your seats in the banqueting hall and stop being so silly." And he dismissed Epimetheus and Prometheus out of hand, and off they went to take their places in the banqueting hall. So Cronos forgot all about what had been said, and they had a lovely wedding and a wedding feast, and everybody was happy, and it was all very joyful. And Cronos and Rhea settled down to actually a very happy married life. He bossed her about, she did as she was told, and everybody was happy. And so eventually nature took its course, and Rhea discovered that she was expecting their first child, and of course she was absolutely thrilled to bits. Children were the proper outcome of a marriage in the ancient world, and so she thought that Cronos would be pleased. And she rushed into his big banqueting hall to announce her pregnancy. Cronos was also apparently delighted by this news. And so after 9 months, Rhea gave birth to their first child. Their first child turned out to be a little girl, a very beautiful little girl that Rhea fell in love with immediately. And she named the baby Hestia. Hestia was good and beautiful, and she didn't cry. She was the perfect baby. And so, having recovered from the birth, Rhea wrapped her precious baby in a nice fluffy white blanket and took her into the big banqueting hall to show Cronos, where, as usual, of course, he was sitting on his big throne looking out the window. The baby was asleep, so she tiptoed up to Cronos and she said to him, "I've had the baby. It's a girl. Her name is Hestia. Would you like to hold her?" "I would," said Cronos in his very loud and booming voice. And so, very carefully, like a precious jewel, Rhea handed the baby over to Cronos. Well, as soon as he took that baby in his arms, the prophecy that Prometheus had given to him came flooding back. "If you have children with Rhea, one of your children will depose you." And he went into an immediate panic, didn't know what to do, so he opened his mouth and he swallowed the baby in one go. I know. Rhea went, "Have you just swallowed our baby?" "Yes," said Cronos, deciding he was going to brazen it out. "Why would you do that?" said Rhea. "Was I not supposed to?" said Cronos. "Absolutely not," said Rhea. "You don't eat your own children." "Oh," said Cronos. "Well, I've never had one before. I didn't know," he said. "Sorry." "Don't do it again," said Rhea. Absolutely unacceptable. And off she stomped. Time passed. Eventually she became pregnant again with the second child, and as luck would have it, this child also was a little girl, and she named her Demeter. And Demeter was just as lovely as Hestia, although of course nobody could possibly replace the baby that had been eaten. So she wrapped the baby up in a fluffy white blanket and she took her into the throne room to show to her father. "I've had the baby," she said. "Would you like to hold her?" "Yes, I would," said Cronos. And as she handed the baby over, she said, "I've named her Demeter." "Oh, I don't mind if I do," said Cronos, and he opened his mouth and swallowed the baby in one go again. "What did you do that for?" she said. "I told you not to eat babies." He said, "Oh, I'm sorry. You said eat her." She said, "I did not. I said her name was Demeter. What's the matter with you?" "Oh," said Cronos, "I'm sorry. I must have misheard you." "Oh dear. Never mind. Never mind." Well, off Rhea went. She was really quite cross by this stage. Anyway, she became pregnant again, and she had another child, another daughter. And this one she called Hera. But Hera wasn't quite as good-natured as the other two. She was still very beautiful, but she was a bit grumpy and she didn't half cry a lot. Nevertheless, of course, Rhea loved her as only a mother can, and she took her in to see Cronos as usual and handed the baby over, and you'll be unsurprised to know that Cronos opened his mouth and swallowed the baby down in a big gulp. "I can't believe you've done that," she said. "That's 3 now that you've eaten." "Oh, I know," said Cronos. "You caught me out. What I really wanted was a boy. Girls, they're all right, aren't they? But boys are better. Perhaps we could have a boy. Oh, said Rhea. Well, I wish you'd told me that to start with. Right, next time, she said, we'll concentrate really hard and we'll hope that it's a boy. They didn't have much of a grasp of biology in those days. So that's what happened. She became pregnant again and she gave birth to another child. And as luck would have it, this one did turn out to be a boy. A very dark-haired boy with a big frown on his face and dark eyes. And he was quite sort of quiet and rather sort of grumpy looking. But she was thrilled because she thought that her husband would be delighted with this particular baby. So she went rushing into the throne room. I've had the baby, she said. Here he is. I've named him Hades. So she handed the baby over and Cronos took one look at him, opened his mouth and swallowed him in one go. She said, what are you doing? That was a boy. Was it? You never said. I did, said Rhea. Oh, I don't think you did, said Cronos. I didn't hear you anyway. Sorry. She said, that's it now. She said, 4 babies and you've eaten all of them. She said, we'll have one more go, but if you eat the next one, that's it. I'm leaving. So she did become pregnant again and she did have another baby, and this one was called Poseidon. She wrapped him up in a blanket, and this time she didn't go near Cronos. She stood in the door and she said, I've had the baby. It's a boy. It's a boy. I've named him Poseidon. Would you like to see him? I would, said Cronos. Promise you won't eat him? I promise, said Cronos. But of course, as soon as she handed the baby over, he opened his mouth and down the baby went. Right, she said, that's it. Now I've had enough and I'm off. And so she packed her bags and she left. Unfortunately, though, she missed him. Strange, I know, but apart from his baby-eating habits, he wasn't a bad old stick, really. And so eventually they were reunited, and the result of that reunion was another baby, and this one was called Zeus. I'm sure you will recognise his name. So it's taken a while, but Rhea now realised that Cronos was probably going to eat all her children. And so this time she hatched a plan. Instead of giving the baby to Cronos, she went out into the garden of the palace and she found a baby-shaped stone, and she wrapped that up in a woolly blanket instead and took that in to see Cronos. I've had the baby, she said, as usual. And they went through the same process of him promising not to eat it and then eating it. He never really looked at the babies, so he didn't notice that it was a stone and not a real baby. So she took the baby Zeus as far away as possible, and this was the southernmost of the Greek islands, Crete, where she hid him in a cave underneath a mountain called Mount Dicte. And she left a goat to feed him milk and 3 blokes who stood outside called the Curetes, whose job it was to sing very loudly every time the baby cried so that Cronos wouldn't hear him. And she went back to the palace and life continued as normal. Cronos was delighted that he'd eaten all his children and therefore all the threats to him. Rhea was delighted because she'd got a child, a precious child, left. And she went to visit the baby Zeus as often as she could, although, of course, she didn't want to arouse suspicions in Cronos. She did notice, however, that Zeus was growing up remarkably quickly. One minute he was a babe in arms, the next he was a toddler, then he was about 8, and then almost straight away he was a teenager. And we all know what they're like, very difficult. He started asking awkward questions. Why am I living in a cave? What's this goat for? Don't I have a father? What's going on? This is all very strange. I don't really like it very much. And he went on and on and on about it until eventually Rhea told him the whole story. Well, you can imagine. Zeus was horrified. What, you mean to say I could have lived in a palace and had brothers and sisters, lived a normal life, but instead I've got a baby-eating monster for a father? I'm afraid so, said Rhea. Right, said Zeus, we shall have our revenge. And so they went back to the palace together, on the way hatching a plan for how they would get their own back on Zeus, or on Cronos. So Rhea pretended to be cooking, and eventually, after rattling lots of pots and pans, she rushed into the throne room where Cronos was sitting as usual, with an enormous goblet full of this sort of yellowy, foaming liquid, and she held it out to him, saying, "I've just invented this brilliant new drink. You'll absolutely love it. Do you want to try it?" "Oh, yes," said Cronos, "I'm up for anything." And he took the goblet from her. Well, we know what his eating habits were like. He opened his mouth and he downed the potion in one, not knowing that the potion was made up of mustard and salt dissolved in water, which really wasn't very nice at all. He looked at Rhea in horror. "What was that? That was disgusting. Don't ever give me that again," he said, starting to turn a bit of a funny colour. He sort of went pale, then he went a bit yellow, and then he started to retch a bit, as though he was going to be sick. Rhea backed away, and then his face turned green, and the retching turned into projectile vomiting, all over the throne room. Oh no, what a mess! But there, miraculously, in the vomit, were 5 babies still wrapped in their blankets, and a stone still wrapped in its blanket, but the babies were still alive. Good heavens, what a miracle. At that point, Zeus rushed in, picked up his brothers and sisters, had to hold them under a tap, obviously, because they were a bit sicky and sticky, and he shouted at his father, "That's what you get for eating your children. You will never have any more." And there are various stories about what happened to Cronos after that. Perhaps the safest one is to say that he was banished to the underworld, to the deepest abyss in the underworld, and we'll talk about the underworld later on in the year. So Zeus rescued his brothers and sisters, and he took them to the top of the highest mountain in Greece, Mount Olympus, of course, and there they also grew very rapidly to adulthood, and they built palaces for themselves, and of course they became the first generation of Olympian gods. And after they'd grown to adulthood, there was a long war between the Titans and the Olympians, and eventually, with a lot of toing and froing in this war, the Olympian gods won, and so they became the gods that the Greeks worshipped, not the Titans. Although, to be fair, the Titans were largely still around in the world, it's just that they had to take a back seat to the Olympian gods. So, a very peculiar story, I'm sure you'll agree. Should we take it literally? You can if you want. This is the beauty of Greek myths. I think myself that it's probably about a series of ongoing wars between the original inhabitants of Greece, who perhaps worshipped the Titans, and perhaps some incomers who brought the Olympian gods with them. And the toing and froing between the two groups of deities possibly represents that war. Myths are not usually just totally made up out of somebody's head. They're normally stories that have developed over a very long period of time from ancient memories. And to me, this is a story about wars between different groups of people who worshipped different gods. So that's my take on it. Okay, so that's the story. I've managed to keep it down reasonably well. It normally takes me loads longer to tell that story than that. So I'm hoping you'll have about half an hour to get started on the work. Okay, so you should hopefully have the worksheet that goes with the story in front of you. And you'll see that there are some comprehension questions which I would like you to answer in full sentences. That means that you don't start with he, she, it, because, they, any of those words. It's a really good habit to get into, to answer questions in full sentences so that your work makes sense when you come back to it later. Okay, so the marks for each answer are in brackets, and that should give you a clue as to how much you need to write for each one. Those questions will take you part way through the story to the point where Rhea realises that Cronos is going to eat all the children, and that's where the questions end. The second task, the story writing task, should start at that point in the story. Please don't go right back to the beginning and start all over again. Start the story with Rhea coming to that realisation that Cronos is going to eat all her babies, and I'd like you to tell the rest of that story in your own words. You can make it funny if you like, you can make it serious. There are some key spellings on this slide here. And if you struggle with getting started on these things, you'll notice at the bottom of the sheet there are some sentence starters which you are welcome to use. They're divided up into 3 paragraphs because you've all been taught how to write in paragraphs, so you should know how to do that. So you can use those sentence starters if you like. Some of you, I'm sure, will want to do that. Others of you will be perfectly confident writing your own story. So those are the 2 tasks today, and I realise that that's quite a lot of work, but I'm going to ask you to try to get both tasks done, please, because we have got lots of other stuff to do. And we'd like to be able to take these in to mark as soon as you're back in school. Okay, so sorry if it takes you a little bit over your hour, but if you crack on with it, hopefully it shouldn't take you too far over your hour. Okay, I hope that goes well.